Welcome everyone to another evening lecture with Fraunces Tavern Museum. My name is Sarah. I will be your Zoom host for the evening. Remember, if you have any questions at any time during the lecture, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A box. I will be monitoring the Q&A during the lecture, so don't worry about waiting until the end. We will try to get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have. And as always, the views of the speaker are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Sons of the Revolution in the State of New York Incorporated or its Fraunces Tavern Museum. Now let me actually introduce tonight's speaker. Lee Dugatkin is an evolutionary biologist and a historian of science in the Department of Biology at the University of Louisville. He's lectured about his research and books at more than 175 venues in countries around the world. He's the author of 12 books and more than 200 articles. Tonight, he will be speaking about his book, Behind the Crimson Curtain, The Rise and Fall of Peales Museum. I have my copy right here, and we'll have some information for you all on how to get your hands on that. But for now, I am going to turn it over to you, Lee.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this. I wish that I could be doing it in person. I gave a talk, probably 10 years ago in person at the Fraunces Tavern, and it was wonderful. It happened to be the anniversary of Washington's famous speech there. But tonight I am going to talk to you about Charles Wilson Peale's museum. And right now you are looking at one of the most famous paintings in the early United States. It's Charles Wilson Peale's Artist in His Museum. It is a self-portrait that was painted in 1822. And what you're seeing is Peale standing before what was called the Long Room in his Philadelphia museum. By this time, the museum was 36 years old. It opened its doors in 1786, and Peale in this self-portrait is 81. And this museum was a fusion of so many things, natural history, anthropology, and art. Let's see here. I apologize, but for some reason, I'm having trouble forwarding my slides, and I'm not quite sure why that is. Oh boy. Let's see. That sound is causing me trouble. So let me see here. Can we go out of this for a second? I really apologize for this. I'm not really sure why this is happening. So let me see something. I'm going to try to go back in right now, and hopefully I won't have that problem again. I honestly don't know why it happened. Yes, okay, good. So we're okay now. I don't know what was going on there, but now we're back. So Peale saw this museum as a secular shrine, an Enlightenment temple, a place that French Count Volney called a place that housed nothing but truth and reason. It was really the first true museum in the early United States. It was the first museum in the sense of one that was open to the public and large scale. Foremost, it was a natural history museum, and you can see that in the Artist in His Museum. On the bottom, you see a taxidermy kit. So Peale and his sons did almost all of the taxidermy for the specimens in the museum. There's one of the specimens on the bottom. And I also highlighted in the back, it's difficult to see this, but actually Peale painted panoramas of the natural environments of the animals in a particular square there. This was a very, very new thing, and it had just taken off in Europe, and Peale was the one who brought it to the United States. All along there, you see samples and samples and samples of different animals, birds in this case, primarily in this room. But there is also a giant mammoth bone here and here on the bottom right. And there is, in fact, an entire mammoth skeleton that Peale has cleverly hidden behind the crimson curtain in this self-portrait. Now, I'm calling it a mammoth throughout the talk, even though technically it was actually a mastodon, and those aren't the same things, but mammoth was the term that was used in Peale's day. So that's the one that I will use here. So the odds are, if any of you are already familiar with Charles Wilson Peale, it's probably because of his paintings, which today sit in the world's finest museums, both in the United States and all over. And so naturally, art played an important role in Peales Philadelphia Museum as well. So there you see his palette, which he's added to the self-portrait. There's a portrait up there that he's painted, and all along the top of the specimens are other portraits that Peale has painted over the years. Now, unlike European museums that tended to cater to the privileged, Peale viewed his museum as open to everyone, and he encouraged everyone to come, not just the rich and privileged, but everyone. And so in this square here, he's actually painted in various people. And I'm going to zoom in now. And Peale was very strategic in the way that he painted this. So what you see back here is a young man with his arms crossed looking and studying those bird specimens on the wall. Over here, you see a woman, probably a Quaker woman because of the bonnet, and she's staring at the mastodon, mammoth. And in the middle, you see a father putting his hand on his son's shoulder and basically using this as a chance to teach him about science. In the eyes of the early United States, Peale and his museum soon became one. And the epithet that Christopher Wren has in St. Paul's Cathedral in London fits Peale and his museum perfectly. In English, it is, if you seek his monument, just look around. Peale and his museum were viewed as sort of one entity by the 1820s in this self-portrait. But we're getting a little bit ahead of our story, so let me step back and get you to where the artist in his museum was painted. So Peale was born in Annapolis in 1741, and by his early 20s, he had already developed an interest in painting. He was self-taught, but clearly very talented early on. And some of his early paintings caught the eye of this fellow here, John B.L. Bordley, who was a well-to-do aristocrat in Annapolis. And Bordley told his influential friends that something must and shall be done for Charles. And so Bordley and Governor Horatio Sharp and a number of other people put together a fund to send Charles Wilson Peale overseas to study in the London studio of legendary painter Benjamin West. So in December of 1766, Peale boards the Brandon, and he sets sail for an 8-week voyage and lands in London and spends his time studying at the feet of one of the master painters of the day. Most of the time that Peale was in London, from 67 to 69, he was in Benjamin West's studio. But he also had a contact through his father with Benjamin Franklin, and he went to visit the doctor at his lodgings in London, and he sketched out this fairly famous piece here where Polly Stevenson, who was the landlord's young daughter, is sitting in a fairly provocative way with Franklin. And Peale sketched that out while he was there, and he learned all sorts of different techniques from Benjamin West. And so when he comes back to the colonies in 1769, he is already a fairly well-known painter, having worked with West, and he starts doing portraits of people like Colonel George Washington and many others. And so his business as an artist begins to grow. 5 years later, he moves himself and his family to Philadelphia, and he opens up an art studio in his home on Arch Street. John Adams came to visit, and he wrote Abigail after that visit, that Peale was tender, soft, affectionate, and ingenious. So Peale has this art studio starting in 1774, and in 1780, he and the family move over to 62 Lombard Street, which is a much bigger house. There I've highlighted it for you. And he opens up a small painter studio at the rear of that house as well. And this was sort of a common thing for painters of the day to do. In time, he actually added a significant 66-foot extension to the house that had a series of skylights with screens that could be pulled up and down to adjust mood and lighting, and had a much larger studio. That same year, the Pennsylvania Packet, a major newspaper in the area, wrote about Peale's new exhibition room, open for reception and entertainment of all lovers of the fine arts, being ornamented with portraits of a great number of worthy personages. Now, Peale continues to paint, and it's his primary livelihood in the house on Lombard Street. But he's actually never stopped thinking about natural history. And in 1784, somebody asked Peale to sketch out the bones of a mammoth that this person had obtained. And Peale does this, and as he's doing that, the bones are lying on the floor, and he's got his sketch pad. One of his relatives, Nathaniel Ramsey, visits, and Ramsey is absolutely fascinated by these bones. He tells Peale that he thought the mammoth bones so interesting that he would have gone 20 miles to behold such a collection. But it's what Ramsey says next that really starts Peale's mind thinking about big time changes to his art studio. What Ramsey tells him is, doubtless there are many men like myself who would prefer seeing such articles of curiosity, that is, the mammoth bones, than any paintings whatsoever. It would be little trouble to keep them, and the public would be gratified in the sight at such times as they came to see the paintings. And so Peale starts thinking that in addition to the paintings that he has in his studios, if he could acquire natural history exhibits like the mammoth bones that he was sketching out, it would, in fact, not only draw people in for its own inherent value, but also get people to pay attention to Peale's portraits. And essentially, he begins to think about turning his gallery into a museum, and he begins to solicit his friends and colleagues, both through personal encounters and letters and newspaper advertisements. And he begins to collect things like this set of stuffed golden pheasants. The pheasants had been in the aviary of Louis XVI. Peale got them because Washington sent them to Peale when Peale put out the call, and Washington himself had gotten them from Lafayette. And things like this begin to come into Peale's possession. Up here, you see an Angora cat. So this was a stuffed Angora cat that Franklin had obtained from a Madame Helvetius in France and sent Peale. And initially, he had things like this, and he had local things like waterfowl and fish and turtles and lizards and deer and raccoon and squirrels, shells and rocks and things like that. So he was building a small museum of natural history exhibits, as well as some geological bits here and there. And of course, there were the paintings. There were at least 30 major paintings that Peale had done by this time that would have been hanging in his now fledgling museum. There was the painting of Washington that we saw before. He had painted Franklin, Payne, Lafayette, and many others. And so as he continues painting, and as these specimens continue to come into his fledgling museum from his friends and colleagues and the public, he decides to officially open a museum. So the first advertisement for the museum was in July of 1786. And I'm going to read it to you because it says a lot about Peale and what he was thinking. So, does Mr. Peale, ever desirous to please and entertain the public, will make part of his house a repository for natural curiosities. The public, he hopes, will thereby be gratified in the sight of many of the wonderful works of nature which are now closeted and seldom seen. The several articles will be classed and arranged according to their several species. So this was going to be categorized on a Linnaean system. And for the greater ease to the curious, on each piece will be inscribed the place from whence it came and the name of the donor. This also is an attempt to get people of standing to send him specimens so that when other folks come into the museum, they will see that so-and-so made a donation. And Mr. Peale will most thankfully receive the communications of friends who will favor him with their assistance in this undertaking. And so even from the first advertisement, and then almost constantly for the next 30 years when he's doing this sort of thing, he's always calling on the public to help him by sending more and more specimens. So here's an early ticket to Peale's Museum from 1787. Peale designed this. And what we see here is the Book of Nature open across a blazing sun. Below it, we see a quote, "The birds and the beasts will teach thee. If you come, you will see a museum containing the wonderful works of nature, some of which Peale has sketched out on the ticket itself, and of course, curious works of art." And the ticket would cost 25 cents, which is about what it would cost, say, to go to the circus or the theater or something along those lines. And right from the start, Peale viewed this as a way to enlighten the new republic. His vision of the museum was crystal clear to him right from the outset, which was to enlighten the minds of my countrymen and to demonstrate the importance of diffusing a knowledge of the wonderful and various beauties of nature to render the institution a lasting honor and a benefit to America. And it's not long before he starts having dreams of his museum one day becoming a national museum. And he begins writing feelers for this very, very early on. So he wrote General Washington that this museum would allow the young nation to retain with us many things really curious, which would otherwise be sent to Europe. And so he's tapping into Washington's patriotic nature by saying, if we don't have a museum, a national museum like the one I'm building here, these exhibits are just going to go over to Europe. He sends follow-up letters to Washington are more explicit. And in fact, he writes Washington when Washington becomes president, that he hopes that one day the museum would be under congressional patronage. That is, that it would in fact be a national museum. But at this point, Washington doesn't express all that much interest in that. He's got many, many other things going on. And Peale understands that it's not going to happen now, but he has plans for the future. Washington may not be interested, but in the long run, he was still hopeful. On almost a weekly basis, the readers of newspapers like the Pennsylvania Packet and many others would learn of new acquisitions that Peale had made from his museum. These were acquisitions that were not only coming from his friends in the United States and Europe, but from China, from all across India, from all across Africa, from India, from the Pacific Islands, from South America, and of course from North America. And these new specimens flowing into the museum included extraordinary things: hummingbirds and birds of paradise and pelicans and snipes and black panthers and minks and hammerhead sharks and porcupine fish and tiger skulls and a 17-foot long shark from the Western Ocean. The museum is also becoming a museum of anthropology and ethnology. Washington sent him a feathered cap from Tahiti that he had gotten his hands on. Other people had sent fans and weapons from East India, a bow from Madagascar, a sword from Damascus, a pipe from China, a piece from the Bastille prison, and cudgels from the Caribbean, Native American canoes and South American baskets, and many, many other things. And so now it was going into a museum of art, natural history, anthropology, and ethnography. And in fact, there was even more, because for the price of that ticket, for 25 cents, you could, after you were going through the museum in the house, go out to the yard in the back that was a menagerie that was in fact essentially a zoo. In that menagerie, Peale had red doves and cockatoos and eagles and owls and baboons and mongooses and hyenas and other things as well. So by 1791, the museum had really taken off. It was clearly a must-see for people in Philadelphia. And at the time, Philadelphia was America's city of must-sees. Annual attendance varied from anywhere from 3,000 to 12,000, which was quite substantial because Philadelphia at the time had a population of just a little bit over 54,000. And because the museum was establishing itself, Peale built a museum board of directors. And on that board were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Gouverneur Morris, David Rittenhouse, who was the president of the American Philosophical Society, and perhaps most important in the long run, Thomas Jefferson, who began a lifelong friendship with Charles Wilson Peale. Now, with all these specimens coming in, what Peale really needed more than anything else at this point was space. And so what he did was he reached out to the American Philosophical Society and he arranged with them for him to rent a place called Philosophical Hall that the American Philosophical Society owned. And I've highlighted where that is in this sketch here. And what Peale does is he organizes a parade that involves children carrying the specimens from his home, where the museum used to be, over to the American Philosophical Society's Philosophical Hall, and he opens up the museum there. In 1801, Peale's thoughts again turned to the mammoth that had really started the whole thing when he was sketching those bones. That was what essentially got the museum off the ground. And in 1801, Peale starts thinking about the mammoth more because there is some information that a large trove of mammoth bones has been found in New York, up in the Catskills near Newburgh, New York. So he and his sons go up there and they excavate nearly 2 complete mammoth skeletons. And Peale depicts this in probably his second most famous painting after the artist in the museum, which is called the exhumation of the mastodon. So the painting is actually correct. It's a mastodon, even though it was called a mammoth. And here it is. Here's the device and the procedure that Peale put in place to actually excavate the bones. So there's Charles Wilson Peale. And here is this intricate, very, very large device that Peale had built to basically dig out the soil so that a team of people that he hired could be looking for this, could be looking for mammoth bones down there. So it was a giant wheel that you can see in the background, and the wheel was actually powered by men that Peale paid to basically walk at a fairly brisk rate to keep the wheel moving. And when the wheel was moving, what it did was it was pulling this series of buckets that you see in the front. It was a pulley system that would constantly be rotating those buckets, and the workers on the bottom would be drenching out the water that were in the marl pits that was based, that were where they hoped the mammoth bones were. And so you can see the workers down here, and they're filling up the buckets with water, trying to find mammoth bones down there. And in fact, it looks like this fellow right here has found one bone. And as I say, by the time they were done at this site and then a couple of others nearby, they had actually excavated the skeleton of almost two complete mammoth skeletons. One of them, right, was put on display in Peales Museum. We saw that in the artist in his museum painting. There it is behind the crimson curtain. The other one, which we don't have time to get into, actually eventually went over on tour to England. Peale's sons took it over there. When Peale brought the mastodon back to his museum, it became the talk of the country. It was front and center in the museum, and everybody, all the newspapers were covering this. Everybody was talking about the mammoth. And in fact, this word became part and parcel of any description for something that was very, very large in the early United States. So there were people would then, after Peales put the mammoth up in his museum, they would write about a mammoth squash that they were selling at the market. One town, Chester, Pennsylvania, actually had all of the farmers decided one day that they would devote all of the milk that they got from their cows that day into creating a giant 1,200-pound cheese wheel that they sent to President Jefferson, presenting him with a mammoth cheese. And so with the mammoth taking the country by storm, Peale decided that this was the time to, again, bring up this notion of his museum eventually becoming a national museum, one that was supported by the federal government. So in January 1802, Peale reaches out to his good friend Thomas Jefferson, who is now president of the United States, and Jefferson also happens to be president at the same time of the American Philosophical Society. And Peale tells him that he needs space and he needs money. So he writes Jefferson, the laborious though pleasing task of mounting the mammoth skeleton being done gives me leisure to attend to other interests of the museum. Huddled together, my exhibits lose much of their beauty and usefulness. They cannot be seen to advantage for society. But maybe, Peale suggests, Jefferson can help him. Peale writes, in the end, these labors, if done correctly, would be crowned in a national establishment of my museum. And he flat out comes out and asks Jefferson, I wish to know your sentiments on this subject, whether the United States would give encouragement and make provision for the establishment of my museum in the city of Washington. So now he's not only suggesting that it become a national museum, but that it become a national museum in Washington. Jefferson is sympathetic to his friend's appeal for national support. He writes, Peale, no person on earth can entertain a higher idea than I do of the value of your collection, nor give you more credit for the unwearied perseverance and skill with which you have prosecuted it. And I very much wish it could be a public property. But he claims his hands are tied by Congress. I must not suffer my partiality to it to excite false expectations in you, which might eventually be disappointed. You know that one of the great questions which has divided political opinion in this country is whether Congress is authorized by the Constitution to apply the public money to any but the purposes specifically enumerated in the Constitution. And many have always denied that Congress has the power to establish a national academy, meaning a national university. Similarly, Jefferson argues that he thinks that people will not support the notion of a national museum. I believe the opinion of a want of power to be that of the majority of the legislature. It's not going to happen, Jefferson says, but he tells Peale that if someday I have my University of Virginia, I want you to come down and bring your museum there. And Peale writes back and he says, your communication has satisfied my mind. As it seems from the present nature of the Constitution, it would be an unproductive effort. So instead of moving to Washington, what Peale does is he expands, but he expands within Philadelphia. So here's the philosophical hall where the museum is now housed. And what Peale does is he keeps some of the exhibits in philosophical hall, but he moves many of them to the second floor of the State Hall, which he has now obtained permission to use from the city of Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania. So a large chunk of the museum is then moved from Philosophical Hall over to the second floor of the State House. There is no more historical spot in the United States at this time than the State House. Peales Museum is now located on the second floor, the entire second floor of the State House, or the majority of his museum is there. That means that it is sitting one floor above where the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were signed, and it's sitting one floor beneath where what today we call the Liberty Bell was ringing every day. There were multiple entrances to all of these museums, both in Philosophical Hall and in the State House, and the entrances made it very clear what the museum was about. One said museum, great school of nature. Another one called it, had a sign that called it the school of wisdom. Another entrance had a sign that said, whosoever would learn wisdom, let him enter here. So the State House exhibit, there was the Mammoth Room, where the mammoth was housed, and now there was an increase to the ticket price if you actually wanted to go into the Mammoth Room. You had to pay an extra quarter. But there was also a quadruped room that housed grizzly bears, an orangutan, a giant anteater, a llama, an elk, and various African antelopes. There was a marine room that housed fishes, amphibians, corals, and sponges, and also a 185-pound bivalve with a 3-foot shell. In the State House is where the long room that you saw in The Artist in His Museum sat. Here is another depiction of it by Peale and one of his sons. So there are the natural history exhibits. There is one of the cabinets that included 5,000 or more insect specimens. And in fact, Peale had created a stand that had a primitive microscope so that you could put the tiniest of the insects underneath it and actually see what it looked like. And it was sort of a rotating thing where you could put multiple insects and just rotate through and see what they look like. Of course, there are the portraits, the vast majority of which either Charles Wilson Peale or one of his sons had painted. And the museum, particularly in State Hall, became the public face of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So basically, when Lewis and Clark were sending back specimens to President Jefferson, Jefferson kept a few, some of the best ones that he kept first in Washington and then brought down to Monticello. But the majority of the specimens were actually housed in Peales Museum. So by 1810, Peale has been running the museum for 24 years, and he decides that it is time for him to retire, and he passes the torch on to one of his sons named Rubens. Peale named his sons mostly after famous artists. So Rubens took over the museum in 1810. Peale officially retires, although he's pretty much still running the museum from the background, and eventually this is going to cause some problems for Rubens, but not yet. So Rubens takes over the Peale Museum in 1810. Then Rubens' older brother, Rembrandt Peale, probably the most talented of all the Peale family painters, opens up a spin-off Peale Museum in Baltimore. And there's a ticket where you see the building. The Peale Museum actually still exists in Baltimore, although it's no longer at the same location. This museum was actually the first building in the United States that was constructed specifically to be a museum. So Rembrandt was running the spin-off museum in Baltimore. Almost all of the articles came from the Philadelphia Museum, which was now getting so many items. There were more than 120,000 items that the Philadelphia Museum was now housing. They couldn't exhibit them all. And so both his brother Rubens and his father Charles were gracious enough to help him seed his museum with natural history and ethnography and art, primarily that they sent from the Philadelphia Museum. In 1825, Rubens gets tired of running the Philadelphia Museum because, as I say, his father Charles retired 15 years before that, but really still was running the museum from the background. And Rubens decides he wants to do something more on his own. And so what he does is he opens up a Peale spin-off museum in New York City called Peales Museum, New York Museum and Gallery of Fine Arts. Again, this is largely stocked with items from the Philadelphia Museum. The Philadelphia Museum, once Rubens goes over and opens up this spin-off in New York, is being run by Rubens' nephew, Edmund Peale. So it's still staying in the family. A couple of years after Rubens opens up the New York City Peale Museum, Charles Wilson Peale dies in 1827, 2 years after he painted this artist in his museum painting. So when Peale died, the Philadelphia Museum, the Baltimore Museum, and the New York Peale Museums were all up and going, run by various different family members. But by the time Peale dies in 1827, the museums, including the main one in Philadelphia, weren't drawing in nearly the crowds that they used to. The public became less and less interested in this kind of rational entertainment, and they were looking for other sorts of entertainment. As time went on, this became more and more of a problem for the Peale museums all over. The first sign of this came in 1842 when P.T. Barnum opened up his famous American Museum in New York City at the corner of Broadway and Ann Streets, very close to Rubens' New York Museum. Barnum claimed that tens of thousands of people came into his American Museum every week, which was probably a Barnum-esque overestimate, but nonetheless, it was drawing many, many people. In part by putting out things like the Fiji mermaid fraud, but there were also respectable natural history items in P.T. Barnum's museum, but it was also a place that was meant to bewilder and shock with things like the Fiji mermaid. In a couple of years after Barnum opened up his American Museum, Rubens just couldn't keep the doors open anymore to his New York Peale Museum. The competition was too much. He sold the museum in 1842, and that same year, Barnum bought up all of the museum's contents and brought them over to his American Museum. But Barnum was only just getting started. In 1845, he gobbled up the Peale Museum in Baltimore. This was again run by Rubens' nephew, Edmund Peale, and he just couldn't make any money off it anymore. The public just wasn't coming in. He sold it to Barnum, who was happy to swoop in and pay almost nothing for it. And again, moved the exhibits primarily to his American Museum in New York City. And Barnum is slowly building up this chain of museums by acquiring the competition, including now the New York and Baltimore Peale museums, as well as some other smaller museums, and scouting the world for new quote unquote talent that he could bring into his American Museum. In 1849, Barnum comes to Philadelphia, and he opens up a branch of his American Museum in Philadelphia, very close to the Peale Museum in Philadelphia, in a building called the Swain Building. Barnum wrote his partner, Kimball, that he'd kill the other shop in no time, the other shop meaning Peale's Museum nearby. So up on the right here, you see the last building that the Peale Museum resided in. It moved around a bit from the time Peale died until 1849. And it just couldn't keep up. It wasn't that enough people were not coming to the Peale Museum in Philadelphia in the first place. And then when Barnum opened his museum, the Peale Museum in Philadelphia just couldn't keep up. Their last advertisement was August 27th, 1849. But in that same year, the Philadelphia Museum closed up its doors, and everything except the paintings went on the auction block. Barnum was at the auction. He bought it all for $5,000 or $6,000 on joint account with his partner, Moses Kimball. So now he had gobbled up the Peale Museum in New York and the Peale Museum in Baltimore, and now the main Peale Museum in Philadelphia. And he moved all of the exhibits mostly to the American Museum, although he did keep some in the Philadelphia Museum in the Swain Building. But in fact, almost all those exhibits no longer exist, and that's because the Swain Building burned to the ground in 1851, and the American Museum, in probably the most famous fire in the early United States, burned to the ground in 1865. So the vast majority of exhibits that were in any of the Peale museums are lost. Not all of them, but the vast majority. The ones that we know, the ones that were saved by various different means, actually reside in the Anthropology Museum, the Peabody Anthropology Museum at Harvard these days. But as I say, the paintings were not auctioned off. Instead, the United States Bank purchased 160 of the portraits and paintings that were in the museum, and they sold them to the city of Philadelphia. And those paintings have fared much better. Those are the paintings that you can see all over Philadelphia today. If you go into almost any place that has major paintings in Philadelphia, you'll see Peale paintings. You'll see them in the National. You'll see them in Washington, in the National Portrait Gallery, and all over the world. One of those portraits was the artist in his museum. The artist in his museum captured everything about Charles Wilson Peale and his museum, which again had become one by that time. It captured natural history. It captured anthropology. It captured ethnography. It captured art. And I think the best way to describe it is it captured the Enlightenment ethos. And so with that, I will stop and will happily take any questions that you have. And I appreciate you taking the time to do this. And let me see here if I can now get out of my slides and get myself back up here. So let's see. Hang on. All right, so I go. Just one moment, and I will get my video back on. I hope. Here we go. This should do it. There we go.
There you are. Well, thank you for that talk. That was wonderful. It was really interesting. I encourage everyone to go out and get the book, get it from a store, get it from a library. It's really fascinating. There's a lot of details there. But for now, if you have any questions, submit them. I'm going to start with, Judith from the chat asks, did all of his sons continue as artists?
Well, Rembrandt did, and that was his primary occupation, was an artist. And as I say, Rembrandt is widely regarded as the best painter of the Peale family. Rubens wanted to paint from an early age, and he did have some talent, but he had extraordinarily bad eyesight, enough so that he really could not become an artist for his occupation. And that's why Peale had, his father Charles had basically groomed him to take over the museum. Another brother, Raphael, was also a good painter. And so, yeah, a number of them did. And then his daughter, Sophie, was also a good painter. And then a number of nephews and nieces continued the Peale the Peale tradition of art. And in fact, if you go to some of the museums where you see Rembrandt and Charles's paintings, you will see paintings from these other folks as well.
Yeah, I was really interested by the fact that the museum seemed to be such a family affair. So many of his children were involved at some time. And we mostly talked about his sons. Were any of his daughters involved in the museums at all?
They were involved somewhat, but not as nearly as much as his sons, because they were involved. They made some sketches and some drawings that were put around the museum as sort of guides and explanations of what this and that was. The sons, while some of their paintings were up on the wall, most of the paintings up there were Charles's. The sons were largely involved, especially when they were young, in the taxidermy work. And at that time, that was just not something that he would have had his daughter involved with, nor would I think she would have been that interested.
So another question from Jill. Was Peale's vision of a national museum particularly new or American, or was it based on what was being done in Europe?
Well, so he certainly was thinking about the British Museum and museums in France when he was envisioning the notion of a national museum. So some of the ideas that he had, including drawing the scenes behind the animals in those scenes, the backdrops and various other things, and just sort of how you build a museum. Peale got from his time working with Benjamin Mest when he had gone to museums there, and from various other things. So some of his sons been in Europe and visited museums in Paris. But I don't think he ever envisioned his museum having branches overseas. It was going to be a national museum. And he made the offer to Jefferson to bring the museum to Washington. That's mostly because he just wasn't getting the kind of response he wanted from the state of Pennsylvania to make it even a state museum. His preference would have been to have it be a national museum, but situated in Philadelphia, which of course was the capital for a while, but he would have envisioned it being there even when it wasn't the capital anymore. And he basically offered Jefferson the Washington idea because he just wasn't getting the feedback that he wanted from the state of Pennsylvania.
Great. We have another question. What was done to label the specimens and the paintings so people would know what they were looking at? Were there labels, or were you just kind of on your own to observe what was in there?
Yeah, so all of the exhibits actually had little placards that would describe what would give the common name and the species name in Latin, and sometimes they would have a little bit of natural history information on it, and they would also have when Peale had the information, he would say where they had been collected from and who had donated it. And there was also kind of a guide of many of the things up on the walls of different rooms. And these were the kind of things that, for example, his daughter would have helped, Sophie would have helped produce. And so, yes, they weren't just going in blind. As time went on and the museum got bigger and bigger, there was more and more. In fact, there was a guide to the Philadelphia Museum that you could have bought when you came in, that wouldn't necessarily say, go here to see this and go there to see that, but was sort of a catalog of everything that was in the museum. I've been able to collect actually a number of original Peale things, but I haven't been able to get my hands on one of those. Actually, so I'm pointing up there. You might be able to see, let me see if I can get this just a little bit higher, right? Okay, so that on top, that is actually was made on this special device that Peale and others had created that basically you would sit and this machine would cut your profile, and it would in fact cut 4 copies of it. And these things were, as you can see, well, it's kind of difficult to see, but from up there, but they were pretty small. So they're about 2 inches by 1 inch. So it was sort of the kind of thing that for, I believe it was like 8 cents or something, you could sit for one of these things, and the machine would be sort of, someone would be working the machine in front of you, and at the end you would get 4 copies, and they were like wallet-sized photos that you could give your family. But so I guess I was saying this because I have not been able to, I've seen one at the library company and various other places, but the catalogs of the museum itself, you can't get originals. You can get copies, but you can't get originals.
Yeah, I was really struck reading the book by how focused on method and organization Peale was with his museums. I particularly liked what jumped out at me. At one point, you wrote about he visits New York City and he goes to Gardner Baker's American Museum, and he says that it's arranged without method, promiscuously jumbled together, not really to his taste. But what really jumped out at me was that that museum was located at the intersection of Pearl and Broad Street, which is where our museum is today. So it had to be one of the neighboring spaces. There was a museum at the time, and now we're the only one down there now.
Okay. So I'm just trying to think about the location now. So that means it was probably also close to where the American Museum was, because Gardner Baker's Museum, after various twists and turns, eventually became the American Museum. So that you were probably not that far from where the American Museum was. It was one of my slides. I don't remember now at what intersection, Broadway and something else. I can't remember, but that's great to know.
Yeah, we're very close. It's a museum neighborhood. Of course, Peale thought it was, I think he said it was a dirty, out of the way part of the city, but.
No, it was, right. At that time it was,
At
but,
that time.
but yeah, no, so back to the methodology, absolutely. So Peale, you know, he actually revolutionized many of the taxidermic methods that were being used at the time, because he was getting, you know, literally thousands and thousands of these items every year, and they had to be preserved. I mean, except for the menagerie in the back, these are all specimens that need to be preserved and shown in the museum. And he came up with all sorts of ways to do this. And in fact, they were revolutionary in their time, but they were also actually quite dangerous. It's thought that some of the chemicals might have been involved in causing illness in some of Peale's sons later on, because I think, you know, you would be working with pretty nasty things, including arsenic, to do this.
Yeah, definitely very dangerous to be doing this kind of stuff back then, or to be doing most things back then. I feel like there was arsenic in almost everything.
Yes.
We have time for one more question from the chat. Eric asks, did any of his collection end up with the Smithsonian, or, you know, did Barnum snatch all of it up and then it was all kind of lost to fire in history?
Did any of it end up in the Smithsonian? I can't give you a definitive answer on that. I don't, if so, very little. So it's not a place that's known as housing any significant numbers of what exhibits. The main place where you will find what survived, and that mostly is kind of the anthropological and ethnographic material, is at the Peabody Museum at Harvard. I was lucky enough to kind of walk through it once, and it's you can walk, it's a public museum, you can walk through it, and it is, you know, it has the largest collection. It's not a huge collection, but if I recall, maybe it's like 2 or 3 rooms worth. So not trivial, but not huge.
Yeah, it seems like Barnum was really going for all that Peale stuff in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. It seems like he was collecting it all up.
Yeah, he was, and he was doing that. You know, by that time there were smaller kind of dime store museum kind of things, and Barnum was pretty much doing this to anything he could get his hands on. But the Peale museums were, particularly the Philadelphia one, was a very large acquisition.
Marie from the chat just says the mastodon is in Germany, but it was in the Alexander von Humboldt show at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art in 2020 and 2021.
Yes. That's absolutely correct.
Very cool.
And I think it's back in Germany now. So I'm not sure if that was actually the one that went on tour, that Peale's son took on tour to England, or it was the one that was in the museum itself, but it's one of those two. And for a while, you know, there's a good story where you know, they were the first ones to really reconstruct from almost full skeletons what we now know was a mastodon. And initially they actually had the tusks going the wrong way, because the notion at that time was that the mastodon, what they were calling the mammoth, was just this gigantic killer that roaming the forest and ravaging everything that it came in contact with. And so they just assumed that the tusks were pointing down, but in fact they eventually figured out that they were pointing up, because it's mostly a vegetarian.
Yeah, it's mentioned a few times in the book, all these advertisements about come see the mammoth and its enormous teeth that it must have been killing so many creatures with different, as we learn more, all of our understandings of things change.
Yeah. There's a great book on that if people are interested. It's by Paul Seminon, and I think it's called American Monster. And it's all about the history of the mammoth/mastodon, and it's a great read.
Awesome. So that's all the time we have. And speaking of great reads, check out Behind the Crimson Curtain, The Rise and Fall of Peales Museum. There is a lot more information that we didn't have time to cover today. The link is in the chat if you want to go directly to it, but it can be found, wherever you can find your books. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and for answering our questions. Thank you to everyone joining us at home for joining us, for listening, for submitting your questions. And thank you to those of you who have donated to the museum. You are helping us fulfill our mission to share the history of the American Revolutionary era with the public. If you'd like to make a donation, you could do that on our website at FrauncestavernMuseum.org. There you can also join our mailing list to stay up to date. We don't have our new slate of programs for the new year up yet. So if you want to be notified when that's happening, the best way is to join our mailing list and get our monthly emails. You could also find our social media there as well. So that's it for this evening. Thank you all again for joining us at another Fraunces Tavern Museum lecture, and we hope to see you soon, either in person or at the museum.
Yes, thank you very much. It was an honor to have the chance to talk to everybody, and thank you.
All right, good night, everyone.